If you know what dignity costs, you never laugh when it walks through the door. Margaret Hayes held her purse with both hands as she stood beneath the bright chandeliers of First National Bank, trying to steady her breathing while the morning line moved slowly ahead of her. At 72, she was smaller than most of the people around her, but there was nothing small about the way she carried herself. Her silver hair was pinned into a neat bun, her skirt was pressed carefully, and though her shoes had seen better days, she wore them with the quiet pride of a woman who had earned every step. She had spent 6 months saving every spare dollar she could find, taking extra cleaning work before sunrise, skipping lunches, and walking nearly 3 miles each day instead of paying for the bus. Every bill in her envelope represented time, pain, patience, and faith. She was here to deposit enough money to keep the small house her late husband had left her, the only place that still felt like home after 47 years of marriage. When her number was finally called, she approached the counter with a polite smile and placed the envelope in front of the teller. The young man looked up with the flat expression of someone who had already decided not to respect her. His name tag read Brandon Mitchell, account manager. His shirt was crisp, his hair was perfect, and his voice carried the kind of practiced politeness that never reached the eyes. "Good morning," Margaret said softly. "I'd like to deposit this into my account, please." Brandon picked up the envelope as if he were handling something he did not want to touch, then glanced inside and let out a small, irritated sigh. "Cash deposits take extra processing," he said, a little too loudly. "And this is a fairly unusual amount for someone like you." Margaret blinked, unsure she had heard him correctly. "I counted it 3 times, she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "It's all there." Brandon leaned back slightly and tapped at his keyboard, speaking in the tone of a man explaining basic facts to a child. "Mrs. Hayes, this is a domestic worker account, correct?" The words landed hard, not because they were new, but because he used them like a label of shame. Margaret's chin lifted. "I've cleaned homes for 50 years, she said. "I earned this money honestly." Brandon's smile sharpened. "Honest money still requires documentation," he said. "Large cash deposits can raise concerns." Margaret felt the attention in the room begin to shift. A woman near the window looked over. A man in a navy suit frowned into his coffee. Brandon pushed the bills back toward her and lowered his voice just enough to sound cruel in a calm way. "Where exactly did this come from?" he asked. "Because if you can't prove it, I can't process it." Margaret's fingers tightened around the envelope. She had come in prepared for paperwork, not humiliation. She had come in as a customer, not as a suspect. And just as her eyes began to sting, a quiet voice came from behind her, low and unmistakably cold. "You should be very careful about who you choose to disrespect in public." Brandon went still at the sound of that voice, and the atmosphere around the counter changed at once. The other customers, who had been pretending not to listen, now looked openly toward the man in the charcoal suit. He stepped forward with the kind of measured calm that made the room feel smaller, and Margaret could see, even through her blur of tears, that he was not a man who often had to repeat himself. "I said," he continued, each word smooth and dangerous in its quietness, "you should be very careful about who you choose to disrespect in public." Brandon swallowed hard. "Sir, I was only following bank procedure." The man did not glance at him. His attention stayed on Margaret, on the envelope in her shaking hands, on the humiliation written across her face. "No," he said. "You were making an elderly woman feel like a criminal because it was easier than doing your job properly." Margaret stared at him, uncertain whether to step back or thank him. He was too polished, too composed, too impossible to place. There was something expensive about him that had nothing to do with his suit. Something in the angle of his shoulders, the way the bank staff suddenly stopped moving, the way even the security guard near the door straightened without being told. "Ma'am," he said gently, turning to her at last. "Are you all right?" No one had asked her that in years with such plain sincerity. Margaret's throat tightened. She nodded once, but the motion was small and fragile. "I am sorry," she said softly, embarrassed by the tears she could not seem to stop. "I did not mean to cause trouble." His gaze softened just slightly, though the steel never left it. "You did not cause trouble," he replied. "You came here to deposit your money. That is all." Brandon let out a nervous breath and glanced toward the branch manager, who had started walking quickly from the back office. The name on the suit jacket of the stranger was now visible to Margaret in clean silver stitching, and though she could not yet understand why the sight made the manager paler, she noticed the way the man in front of her barely shifted when the bank's authority approached. "Mr. Castellano," the manager said, his voice suddenly careful, "I was not aware you were in the lobby." Margaret looked from one face to the next, trying to make sense of the sudden fear spreading through the bank like a shadow. William Castellano did not answer the manager first. He reached out, not to take her money, but to gently push the envelope back toward her hands. "Keep hold of that," he told Margaret. "No one is taking it from you." The simple kindness of the gesture made her breath catch. Then he turned his head toward the teller, and his expression hardened again. "You will process this deposit," he said, "and you will apologize to Mrs. Hayes before she leaves this counter." Brandon nodded too quickly. "Yes, sir. Of course, sir." Margaret remained frozen, hearing her own heartbeat louder than the murmur of the lobby. She had expected shame, maybe a wasted morning, perhaps a long walk home with her dignity bruised. What she had not expected was to stand beside a powerful stranger who spoke about her as if her age, her labor, and her honesty mattered. And when William Castellano looked back at her, there was no pity in his face at all, only a strange, steady respect that made her stand a little taller than she had a moment before. William Castellano did not move away from the counter. He stayed where he was, one hand resting lightly on the polished edge, his presence filling the space that Brandon had emptied with fear. Margaret could still feel the heat of shame in her cheeks, but it was weakening now, replaced by something she had not felt in a long time. Safety. Not the kind that came from locks or alarms, but the quiet certainty that someone had decided she would not be harmed here. Brandon muttered an apology so fast it nearly disappeared into the hum of the lobby, and William did not even look satisfied. He only watched until the deposit was being processed properly, his blue eyes fixed on every nervous movement of the teller's hands. Margaret stood beside him in silence, hearing the soft click of keys, the rustle of bills, the careful sound of a machine doing what it should have done in the first place. "There," Brandon said at last, his voice strained and thin. "The deposit is complete." William reached for the receipt first and handed it to Margaret himself, making sure she took it with both hands. "Keep that," he said quietly. "You have every right to leave here with proof that your money was accepted." Margaret stared at the paper as if it were something fragile and sacred. After a long life of being told to wait, to move aside, to not make trouble, to be grateful for less than she deserved, that small act felt almost overwhelming. Her fingers tightened around the receipt, and when she looked up at William, she found him already watching her with a calm that did not ask for anything in return. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice low and uncertain. William's expression did not change, but something in his eyes softened. "Because you were being treated like you were invisible," he said. "And you are not invisible." The words landed on her like warm sunlight through a window. No one had spoken to her that way in years. Not with admiration, not with certainty, not as if her life had weight. Around them, the lobby had gone strangely quiet. The woman in pearls had stopped pretending to study her phone. The man in the business suit looked down at his shoes. Even Brandon seemed to have shrunk behind the counter, all his confidence drained away by the simple fact that he had been witnessed. Margaret took a careful breath and felt her shoulders settle. For the first time that morning, she was standing straighter. William noticed it at once. "Do you need someone to walk with you?" he asked. The question was so unexpected that Margaret blinked. "No, I can manage." "I am sure you can," he said. That was never the question. It was such an odd thing to say, and yet it made her almost smile. Almost. He glanced toward the door, then back at her. "But if you would allow it, I would like to make sure you get to your car safely." Margaret hesitated only a moment before nodding. The bank now felt smaller than it had before, as if the whole room had been rearranged by one man's decision to stand beside her. She turned toward the exit with her receipt in hand, and William fell into step beside her without crowding her, without rushing her, simply matching her pace as though it mattered. Behind them, the lobby remained frozen in a hush that said more than any apology ever could. Margaret had barely reached the glass doors when the weight of the morning seemed to shift behind her, as if the bank itself were holding its breath. William walked beside her in silence, his polished shoes making no effort to hurry her, while Margaret adjusted her grip on the receipt she had been given, still half convinced that the moment would somehow collapse back into humiliation the second she stepped outside. The air beyond the lobby was brighter, cooler, touched with the clean edge of late morning sunlight, and for the first time in hours, she could feel her lungs fill without shame tightening around them. "You should not have had to endure that," William said at last, his voice low and even, meant for her alone. Margaret looked up at him, searching his face for the usual signs she had learned to expect from powerful men: impatience, calculation, a thin smile that never reached the eyes. Instead, she found only stillness. "I have endured worse," she said quietly, then immediately regretted how old the words sounded. William glanced toward the parked cars beyond the curb, then back to her. "That does not make it acceptable." It was such a simple answer that it nearly undid her. No man had ever spoken to her as though her suffering had been worth noticing, let alone worth correcting. She lowered her eyes to her shoes, the worn leather creased at the toes, and then to the envelope in her hand. "I just needed to pay my taxes," she murmured. "That was all." "And you did," William replied. "You came here in good faith. You should leave with your dignity intact." The word dignity landed softly, but it carried more force than any raised voice could have. Margaret stood there for a moment, the traffic passing by in slow ribbons beyond the bank windows, while a few late customers glanced toward them and then quickly looked away. Somewhere inside, a door opened and closed. A phone rang. Life went on as if nothing had happened. Yet for Margaret, something had shifted so completely that the sidewalk beneath her felt different, steadier somehow, as though she had been returned to herself. William noticed the way her shoulders remained tense, the way she still looked as if she expected another insult from the air itself, and he frowned slightly. "How long have you been carrying this burden alone?" he asked. Margaret gave a small, tired laugh that held no humor at all. "Long enough to forget what it feels like to be helped without being judged." The answer hung between them, plain and painful. William said nothing for a beat, and in that silence there was no discomfort, only attention. When he finally spoke again, his tone had softened in a way that would have surprised anyone inside the bank who thought they knew him. "Then let this be the first time you are not carrying it alone." Margaret studied him. This man in the charcoal suit with the careful voice and the hard edges he kept hidden just beneath the surface. He was clearly used to being obeyed. He was not used to being doubted. And yet there was something almost reverent in the way he stood there now, as if he understood that the smallest act of respect could change the shape of an entire day. She nodded once, because there was nothing else she trusted herself to do. William stepped slightly aside so she could pass, then paused when he saw how slowly she moved, one careful step at a time. Without making a scene of it, he matched her pace again, escorting her across the lot until they reached the faded blue sedan parked near the edge of the building. Margaret stopped beside the driver's door, surprised by how much that short walk had steadied her breathing. She turned to face him, and for a brief second the noise of the city seemed distant, almost unreal. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words were stronger. William inclined his head, his expression unreadable but gentle. "You do not need to thank me for basic decency," he said. Then, after a quiet pause, he added, "But you are welcome." Margaret let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in her chest all morning, and the faintest trace of a smile finally touched her mouth. For a few seconds they simply stood there in the sunlight, one elderly woman in a worn skirt, one powerful man in an immaculate suit, both of them held in a silence that no longer felt cold. Inside the bank, Brandon was still learning what consequences sounded like, but outside, Margaret had already learned something far more important. That being seen properly could feel like being given back to herself. By the time Margaret reached the curb, the morning no longer felt quite as heavy as it had when she walked into the bank. Her receipt rested safely in her hand, the edges already soft from how tightly she had held it. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that the money she had earned with aching hands and careful sacrifice was finally where it belonged. William had remained near her long enough to make sure no one inside dared to call after her. And then, when she did not need him anymore, he had simply stayed close enough to matter without making her feel smaller for needing help. It was an unfamiliar kind of mercy, quiet and steady, and it left her strangely unguarded. The Blacktown car waited just beyond the glass entrance, its windows dark and polished, too expensive to belong to the street around it. William opened the rear door with an ease that suggested he was used to being obeyed, though he did not ask Margaret to get in. He only stood beside the open door and looked at her with that same calm, searching expression. "You should not walk home alone with cash in your purse," he said. Margaret almost smiled at that, though the word cash sounded odd after the morning she had survived. "It is not much," she replied, touching the envelope through her purse as if to reassure herself it was still there. "It is enough to matter," William said. He glanced once toward the bank doors, where Brandon had not appeared, and then back to Margaret. "Do you live far from here?" "About 2 miles," she said. "I usually take the bus, but today I came early so I would not miss my turn." William nodded once, as if filing the information away. Then, with no trace of impatience, he said, "Then I will drive you." Margaret blinked. "You do not have to do that." "I know." His voice was low, measured, leaving no room for argument. "I am doing it anyway." For a moment, she simply stood there, the wind tugging gently at the loose edge of her skirt, while the city moved around them without noticing the small, strange dignity of the scene. The traffic hummed. A taxi passed. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck rattled over the pavement. And still William waited, one hand resting lightly near the car door, not pressing, not insisting, only present. Margaret had met plenty of men who liked to be seen helping, who wanted witnesses for their generosity. William did not seem to care whether anyone watched. That made it harder to refuse him, so she gave a small nod and moved toward the open door. He did not touch her arm. He did not guide her. He only stepped back enough to give her room, and Margaret noticed, with a quiet surprise, that this simple courtesy felt more valuable than all the polished smiles she had received inside the bank. Once she settled into the seat, the car door shut with a soft, expensive sound that seemed to close the morning behind her. William came around to the other side and got in beside her, sitting with a straight back and an unreadable face, as if escorting an elderly woman home were the most natural thing in the world. The driver pulled smoothly into traffic. For several blocks, neither of them spoke. Margaret watched storefronts slide past the tinted window, her reflection faint and ghost-like against the glass. She felt the old ache in her knees, the familiar pull of fatigue in her shoulders, but beneath it was something new, fragile but real. Relief. "I was not always a housekeeper," she said suddenly, surprising even herself. William turned his head slightly. No, Margaret said, her fingers tightening around the receipt. "I was a seamstress when I was younger. I made dresses for 3 different shops before my husband got sick. After that, I took whatever work I could find." Her voice did not tremble, but it softened around the edges of the memory. "People always think a woman like me appeared this way by accident, as if a life can be measured by what is left in her purse." William looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed. "People mistake weariness for weakness." Margaret gave a small, tired laugh. "And age for invisibility." "Yes," he said. "That too." The car passed a row of brownstones and then slowed near a corner with a small grocery, a laundromat, and a pharmacy with faded blue lettering. Margaret pointed to the side street beyond. "You can let me out there." William looked where she pointed, then back at her. "I will take you to your door." She started to protest, but he had already signaled the driver. A few minutes later, the car rolled to a stop in front of her modest home, a narrow house with peeling white trim and a porch that leaned slightly to the left. Margaret sat very still for a second, as though seeing it through his eyes. It was not grand. It was not impressive, but it was hers. William noticed the way she looked at it, and said nothing. Instead, he opened the door and stepped out first, then waited while she gathered her purse and receipt. At the gate, Margaret paused and turned to him. The sunlight caught the hard line of his suit, the expensive watch at his wrist, the calm authority in the set of his shoulders. Yet in that moment, what stood out most was not his power, but the fact that he had chosen to use it gently. "You have done more than enough," she said. William's gaze remained steady. "No," he replied. "Someone should have done that a long time ago." The ride to Margaret's home was quiet, but it was not the kind of silence that made a person feel small. It was the kind that came after truth had finally been spoken aloud. Outside the car window, the city moved in its usual hurry, buses groaning at the curb, pedestrians crossing against the light, storefronts reflecting the pale morning sun. But inside the back seat, Margaret kept both hands folded around her receipt, as if it were something precious and fragile. William sat beside her with the stillness of a man used to command, yet he said nothing to fill the space between them. He did not ask questions she had not offered to answer. He simply watched the road, then glanced at her once, as though making certain she was still breathing more easily than she had been an hour ago. When they pulled up in front of the small house with its chipped paint and sagging porch steps, Margaret looked at it with a kind of tenderness that made William look away for a moment. He had seen mansions wrapped in marble and glass, homes that shouted wealth from every window, but this narrow little place, with its worn gate and flower pots leaning toward the sun, held something those grand houses never could. It held a life that had been worked for, year after year, by hands that had never asked for applause. Margaret reached for the door, but William was already out first, closing it gently behind him and moving around to open her side himself. He did it without ceremony, without drawing attention, as if courtesy were simply the most natural thing in the world. Margaret stepped onto the sidewalk slowly, feeling the morning air brush her face. For a brief moment, she looked embarrassed by the sight of him standing there in a suit that cost more than everything on her porch combined. But William did not seem to notice the difference in their worlds. He only noticed the way she hesitated at the gate, her fingers tightening around the receipt again. "You should come inside," she said at last, surprising herself with the invitation. William's gaze flicked toward the house, then back to her. "Only if you are comfortable with that," he replied. That answer, so careful and so simple, made her throat tighten. No one with power had ever spoken to her as though her comfort mattered. Inside, the house was modest but clean, with framed family photographs lined across a narrow shelf and a faded quilt folded over the arm of the sofa. Margaret moved through the room with the quiet pride of someone who had maintained her home with limited means and unlimited care. William noticed every detail: the sturdy wooden table, the jars of preserved peaches on the counter, the knitted dish towel hanging beside the sink, and he understood without being told that nothing here had been handed to her. Everything had been earned. Margaret set down her purse and receipt, then turned toward him with a small, uncertain smile. "I suppose I should offer you coffee," she said. "It might not be much, but it is honest." William accepted without hesitation. "That is more than enough." She busied herself at the stove, her movements careful but steady, and for the first time since the bank, the tremor in her hands had eased. William stood near the doorway, one hand in his pocket, watching the room as though it contained a history he had only just begun to understand. Then, after a long pause, he said quietly, "Your house is beautiful." Margaret let out a soft breath that was almost a laugh. "It has seen better days. So have most things worth keeping," he said, and the words landed between them with unexpected weight. She turned to look at him then, really look at him, and saw not the dangerous man people might whisper about, but a person who had recognized something in her that morning and had refused to let it be stepped on. The coffee finished dripping into the pot, and Margaret poured 2 cups with hands that no longer shook as badly as before. She brought one to him, and when their fingers touched around the warm ceramic, the room seemed to settle into a peace neither of them had planned for. "I still do not know why you helped me," she said softly. William looked into his cup for a moment before answering. "Because people like Brandon spend too much of their lives deciding who deserves kindness and who does not." He lifted his eyes to hers. "And I have seen enough of the world to know that they are usually wrong." Margaret held his gaze, the silence between them deep and thoughtful. She had expected gratitude to feel smaller than this, but it did not. It felt like dignity restored, like a door opening where there had only been a wall. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees at the edge of the yard, stirring the curtains and carrying the scent of freshly cut grass through the open window. Inside, Margaret sat across from a man she had met only that morning, yet who had already changed the shape of her day, and perhaps something far deeper than that. He had not come to rescue her. He had come to witness her, and somehow that was even greater. And as the light shifted across the little kitchen table, neither of them could yet know that this quiet morning was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The quiet inside Margaret Hayes's kitchen settled over the room like a soft blanket, but beneath it, something had begun to change. The old wooden table, the faded curtains, the chipped blue mug by the sink, all of it looked different now, not because the room had changed, but because Margaret was sitting in it without shame. William Castellano remained near the window, one hand resting loosely in his coat pocket, his presence calm enough to let the afternoon breathe. He had not filled the room with himself. He had simply brought with him a kind of certainty Margaret had not felt in years. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, a school bus rumbled down the street. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked once and then went quiet. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood kept moving, but inside the kitchen, Margaret could feel the deeper stillness that comes when a person finally stops bracing for the worst. She looked down at her receipt again, then folded it carefully along the crease. It was a small gesture, but to her it felt like placing a hand over something fragile and newly returned. "You keep looking at that like it is proof of something," William said at last, his voice low and even. Margaret let out a faint breath that almost became a laugh. "Maybe it is," she said. "Maybe I just need to keep reminding myself that this really happened." William's eyes softened at that. He had seen fear before, and pride, and anger, but this was something else. This was the uneasy disbelief of someone who had spent too long being dismissed and had not yet learned how to trust kindness when it finally arrived. He moved to the chair opposite her, sitting only after she did, as if even the choice of posture should belong to her. "Then remember this," he said. "You did nothing wrong today." Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. People do not usually say that unless they want something. The words came out gently, but they carried the weight of years. William did not look offended. He looked thoughtful, almost solemn. "Then I am sorry for the kind of world that taught you that lesson," he replied. Margaret lifted her eyes to him, and for a second the room seemed to narrow to that small space between them. No one had apologized to her like that in a very long time. Not with pity, not with performance, just truth. It left her quiet. William glanced toward the hallway, then back to her. "Do you live here alone?" he asked. She nodded. "Since my husband passed." The answer seemed to settle somewhere deep in the room. William gave a slight nod, respectful, not prying. "It is a good house," he said. Margaret looked around as if seeing it through his eyes for the first time. The paint might be old and the floorboards might creak, but it was still hers. It had been built on years of labor, sacrifice, and love. "It was his," she said softly. "And now it is mine. And you will keep it," William said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The certainty in his voice should have sounded like control, but to Margaret it felt like protection. She studied him then, the sharp suit, the composed face, the kind of man who seemed built from discipline and distance. Yet there was something else beneath that surface, something steadier than power. "Why would you care?" she asked. William did not answer at once. His gaze drifted toward the sunlit window, where the curtains moved gently with the breeze. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Because I know what it is to lose people and to learn too early that the world can become cold when no one is looking." Margaret did not interrupt. She could hear the difference in him now, the part of him that had not come from boardrooms or money or fear, but from old wounds that had never fully closed. He went on. "My mother cleaned houses for years. My grandmother worked herself to exhaustion. I have watched people with nothing give everything they had and still be treated like they were worth less than the floor under someone else's shoes." He looked back at Margaret, and there was no hardness left in his face, only something that resembled memory. "I did not stop because I wanted gratitude. I stopped because I recognized you." The words landed gently, but they carried a force that made Margaret's chest tighten. Not pity, recognition. That was what he had given her, and it felt more valuable than anything else he could have offered. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel like an old woman being humored by a younger man with too much influence. She felt like someone whose life still mattered. Outside, the afternoon sun shifted a little lower across the yard, brightening the edge of the porch and turning the dust in the light into something almost golden. Margaret followed the movement with her eyes, then looked back at William. "You talk like a man who has made peace with things," she said. A faint shadow moved across his expression, gone almost as quickly as it came. "Not peace," he answered. "Just responsibility." Margaret considered that. It was not the kind of answer a selfish man gave. It was the kind of answer a man gave when he had learned that power meant little if it did not protect someone else. In that moment, the room felt smaller and more honest than any place she had been in all week. She had entered the bank expecting to be made invisible. Instead, she had been seen, defended, and escorted home by a man the world would have feared to challenge. Yet what stayed with her most was not his reputation or even his authority. It was the way he had spoken to her here, in her own kitchen, as if her life had value simply because it existed. William stood slowly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "I should let you rest," he said, though neither of them seemed eager for the moment to end. Margaret rose with him, one hand still resting on the receipt, as if it were a promise. "Thank you," she said again, but this time the words were quieter, fuller, carrying more than gratitude. William held her gaze. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Hayes. Tomorrow, we take care of the taxes." And in the hush that followed, Margaret understood that the morning had not ended with a bank deposit at all. It had ended with her life beginning to bend, gently but unmistakably, in a new direction. By late afternoon, the little house had grown quiet in the way homes do when a difficult morning has finally passed through them and left behind something softer. Margaret sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone mostly untouched, while the receipt William had left beside her rested on the wood like proof that the day had truly happened. Outside, the light had begun to thin into gold, slipping across the curtains and the worn floorboards, and for the first time in a very long while, Margaret did not feel as if she were waiting for the next insult to arrive. William remained near the doorway, not crowding her, not filling the room with his authority, but standing there with the stillness of a man who understood that respect sometimes meant knowing when to be quiet. Margaret looked up at him, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening as she tried, and failed, to hide the emotion in her face. "I keep thinking I should be embarrassed that all of this mattered so much," she said softly. William's expression did not change, but something gentler moved behind his eyes. "It mattered because it should have never happened," he answered. "No one should have made you feel small for earning your own money." Margaret lowered her gaze to the receipt, her fingers pressing lightly against the edge of it. "I have spent so many years learning how to make myself smaller," she admitted. "First for jobs, then for bills, then for people who thought I would not speak up." The words hung in the warm kitchen air, plain and honest. William listened without interrupting, and that alone seemed to loosen something inside her chest. At last, she looked back at him. "You did not have to stay." "No," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I wanted to." The simplicity of it unsettled her more than any grand gesture could have. He was a man people crossed streets to avoid, a man with a presence that made entire rooms fall silent. Yet here, he was in her small kitchen, speaking as though her life were not a detail but a matter of consequence. Margaret let out a slow breath, almost a laugh, though there was still a tremble in it. "You speak as if I am someone worth protecting." William met her eyes without hesitation. "You are." The two words landed with a weight that had nothing to do with his reputation and everything to do with their truth. Margaret felt the tears gather again, but this time they were not tears of humiliation. They were the quiet kind that came when a heart recognized kindness after years of being denied it. She reached out and touched the receipt once more, then set it down with care, as if setting down the last of an old burden. "Then I suppose tomorrow I will start believing that," she said. William's mouth softened at the corners. "Good," he replied. Then, after a pause that felt full rather than empty, he added, "And when you go back to the bank, you will not go alone." Margaret looked at him, startled, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. It was not a promise made to impress her. It was a promise made with the calm certainty of a man who intended to see it through. Outside, evening shadows lengthened across the yard, but inside the kitchen, something steadier had begun to take root. Margaret was still the same woman who had walked into the bank with trembling hands and honest money, but she was no longer carrying the day alone. And in that small, sunlit room, with the smell of tea and old wood and rain lingering in the air, she understood that dignity, once returned, could feel a great deal like hope. By the next morning, Margaret no longer walked to the bank alone. William's black car waited at the curb before the sun had fully lifted above the roofs, its polished surface catching the pale light like a mirror. He stood beside the open rear door in a dark suit that seemed to sharpen the entire street around him. But when Margaret stepped out of her house with her purse held close and her shoulders straight, it was not his power that filled the moment. It was hers. She moved slowly at first, careful in her old shoes, yet there was a steadiness in her step that had not been there 2 days ago. William watched her with quiet approval, then offered his arm. Margaret looked at it for only a second before placing her hand there, not because she needed support, but because she was beginning to understand that accepting help was not the same as surrendering dignity. The drive into town was smooth and silent, the kind of silence that felt respectful rather than heavy. When they arrived, the same bank doors that had once made her stomach tighten now seemed almost ordinary. Still, Margaret felt the old memory of embarrassment brush against her, faint but real. William noticed. He always noticed. "Stay close to me," he said softly. "You do not have to speak unless you want to." Inside, the lobby had the polished brightness of a place designed to impress people who had never been made to feel small. A few customers turned at once when William entered, and the atmosphere changed in that subtle way it does when a room recognizes authority before a single word is spoken. Behind the counter, Brandon went rigid the moment he saw Margaret. His face lost color so quickly it was almost pitiful. He started to stand, then stopped, his hands hovering uselessly over the desk. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, trying and failing to sound composed. "I was informed that you would be coming in." Margaret met his eyes with a calm he had never earned from her. "That is correct," she said. "I was told my deposit and my account would both be handled properly today." William said nothing at first. He simply stood beside her, a quiet presence that turned the entire exchange into something unmistakable. The branch manager appeared from the office within seconds, already aware of who had entered, already regretting whatever had happened before. He hurried forward with a smile too tight to be sincere. "Mrs. Hayes, we are very sorry for yesterday," he said. "There should have never been any question about your funds." Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. Apologies, she had learned, were easy to say when someone important was watching. "I did not come for an apology," she replied at last. "I came because I was promised my account would be corrected." Brandon swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. Of course." He reached for the paperwork with hands that were no longer arrogant, only nervous. William's voice remained calm, but every person in the lobby leaned in a little to hear it. "And the tax payment?" he asked. The branch manager nodded quickly. "Prepared and ready, sir. We can issue the certified check immediately." Margaret glanced up at William then, and something in her face softened in spite of herself. This was not about being rescued anymore. It was about being restored in front of the very people who had once dismissed her as if she did not matter. When the documents were laid before her, she took her time reading each line. She was not pretending to understand every number, and she did not need to. She only needed to know that everything was honest, documented, and hers. At last, she signed her name with a hand that no longer trembled. The pen moved across the paper with the quiet certainty of someone reclaiming what had always belonged to her. When it was finished, the room seemed to exhale. William stepped back just enough to let the moment belong to her fully. Margaret looked at the receipt in her hand, then at the people around her, then finally at the teller who had once spoken to her, as if she were invisible. "Thank you," she said, not to him, but to the air itself, to the day, to the part of her life that had somehow survived long enough to see justice arrive without shouting. Then she turned to William. "I think," she said gently, "I will make tea when we get home." A faint smile touched his mouth. "Then I will accept that invitation," he said. And as they walked back toward the doors together, Margaret Hayes held her head higher than she had in years, not because the world had become kinder overnight, but because she had remembered something it had tried to take from her. Her dignity had never been theirs to give.